My 5-year-old nephew, Tristan, is on the autism spectrum. And when my sister lost her job, my nephew lost access to his health insurance. And all of his therapists, his autism therapists, speech and occupational therapists were like, look, we can't wait 8 months to get in network with this new plan because we're going to lose about $10,000 a day just waiting. Because it seemed like robotics was the future, and maybe if I could help build robots, women wouldn't have to cook and clean, and we could solve the climate crisis. And I think that was the first time I understood the human cost of climate change, because we always assume that everyone has a birthday, which they do, right? Everyone's born. But there's somewhat of a privilege to actually know when that is and to be able to celebrate it and to be able to like really remember the moment that you came into this world. And the fact that he will never have that, and there's no way to recover those records, there's no way to find his family, was really impactful for me at 8. I was 21 when I joined the Foreign Service. I was one of our youngest U.S. diplomats. I'm going to say become a philosopher. And I would say study philosophy, sociology, art, history, because I think that's where the future is going.
Welcome back to Be Anomalous, the podcast for the misfits, the trailblazers, the cultural disruptors, and anyone bold enough to carve their own path. I'm Sai Menon, and this week I sit down with Shai, founder and CEO of Carelumi. But this episode is so much more than startup building. Shai's journey moves across diplomacy, data science, family, identity, care, and innovation. She started her career as one of the youngest US diplomats navigating high stakes global work in her early 20s. But the path that led her to building a company started somewhere much more personal, helping her autistic nephew keep access to the care he needed. What followed is a story about empathy as strategy, problem solving as purpose, and what happens when someone decides they're not going to wait for broken systems to fix themselves. In this episode, we talk about how every experience shaped the way we build, what AI can and cannot replace, and why some of the most powerful companies begin not with ambition alone, but with love, urgency, and proximity to a real problem. This is a conversation about using every version of yourself and building from the places that hurt enough to make you act. So let's get into it. Hi, Shai. Welcome to Be Anomalous. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'm really excited to dive in and learn more about you. So before we get into everything that you're doing, let's just start with your introduction.
Okay. Well, it's really good to see you again, Sai. My name is Shai Bais. I am currently the co-founder and CEO of a startup called Carelumi, where we use AI to automate insurance credentialing for providers. So essentially helping those doctors get paid faster by taking care of the paperwork that they have to submit to all the health insurance companies. But I don't have a healthcare background. I got to this journey in a very unique way, but also a very passionate way. So my 5-year-old nephew, Tristan, is on the autism spectrum. And when my sister lost her job, my nephew lost access to his health insurance. And all of his therapists, his autism therapists, speech and occupational therapists were like, look, we can't wait 8 months to get in network with this new plan because we're going to lose about $10,000 a day just waiting. And so I was like, well, I'll do it for you because his care is important. He also can't wait 8 months to find a new provider. And after that, I realized that we could use AI to automate this process. And they were like, oh, we'll do this for my friend in this other clinic. And it kind of created this effect where I had no intentions on building a company, but the demand and the need was there. And now we've expanded outside of just autism care to really all types of providers. So that's my journey. I guess other details about me. I started my career as a US diplomat. It's also very different from healthcare.
Wow. Yeah.
Originally from Chicago, born and raised. My family is a little bit all over the place as well. My dad is from Jamaica. My mom is from Chicago too. And this has been a unique journey for me, like background and everything, but I'm sure I can talk more about that too as we continue the conversation.
Your journey, unique is an understatement, Shai, with everything that you're doing. And oh my gosh, let's start with your first journey, which is being a US diplomat.
How did that come about? And yeah, tell us what led you to be a US diplomat in your journey in that. What led you to that path?
That's a great question. So it's really funny when you tell people, like, oh, I really want to go to the State Department, and you say that growing up in Chicago, they assume you meant like state government in Springfield, Illinois, not like the US Department of State in Washington, D.C., and that you'll be traveling to all these countries. So it was really challenging, I think, having this desire to do work overseas, but not really having the mentorship or having others who have done it before me to really know how to get there. So my kind of journey really started in undergrad. I went to Georgetown, studied economics and philosophy. I did a lot of work in Georgetown that was probably typical for anyone who's interested in like international overseas work. At the same time, my education was funded by the Gates Foundation, and that's because of my science and technology background in high school. So I did extremely well in science and math, but I also wanted to figure out how to take that abroad, and Georgetown seemed like a really good fit for me personally. Then after Georgetown, I went to Duke University, where I got a master's in data science and really did a concentration in like policy and machine learning. And there I was like, oh wow, I'm like finally connecting the dots with things that I was seeing from undergrad at Duke and trying to figure out, well, how can I make my process more technical? And when I say process, I was really passionate about kind of three things. Like one, understanding how to empower women all over the world, because, you know, it just seemed like there was a big gap there. Two, because of my background and interest in climate, and a lot of that came from my father's story, him growing up in Jamaica, becoming an orphan, because there was a huge hurricane that kind of separated him from his family at a time when the Jamaican government had not yet digitized records. So he also grew up without knowing his birthday and could not be reunited. But thankfully, he was adopted and eventually came to America. But just like learning his own story too kind of helped me think about the things that I cared about. So I knew I cared about climate, I knew I cared about women, and I knew I was very good at science and math. And trying to figure out where's a good fit for that was difficult, but Georgetown, then Duke kind of gave me a pathway to do that. So with the funding that I got from my education through the Gates Foundation, I had to go directly through undergrad to grad school. And then I had a choice. I could either continue my education with a PhD, and I was really focused on kind of human computer interaction because it seemed like robotics was the future. And maybe if I could help build robots, women wouldn't have to cook and clean, and we could solve the climate crisis. Like that's how my brain worked. Yeah. And then I got the offer to join the State Department because I had took the Foreign Service Officer test in undergrad. I also did the oral assessments. It's a very long process to become a diplomat. And then I applied for a fellowship with the State Department as well. And so kind of like graduating from Duke, it was like, okay, either do the PhD or go do your dream to become a diplomat. And that's the one I took.
Wow. I feel like all of your path, like your decisions have been impacted by so many things that's happened around you. For example, with the interest for climate is so influenced by your dad. How did that impact and shape your decisions that you made throughout your childhood and upbringing?
Yeah. So I think for me, even learning about kind of my dad's background, you know, it doesn't come up in like casual conversation.
Yeah.
You know, I was like maybe about 8 or 9, and it was my birthday, and we were getting like excited. My dad was like, what do you want for your birthday? Should we throw a party? What are the plans? And I was like, okay, yeah, these are all my interests. And then I talked to him and I was like, oh, well, when is your birthday? Now, don't ask me why it took me 8 or 9 to actually, you know, want to know that date. I mean, we've celebrated it before, but I was just like, well, what's the day of your birthday? And he's like, oh, you know, I actually don't know my real birthday. And the birthday that I have, surprisingly, was the same day as my grandpa's birthday, which is my mom's father. And he was like, you know, I thought this is great. That's also why I loved your mom, because her dad had the same birthday that, you know, the country gave me. And that's when he started to talk to me more about like his story and why he didn't know his birthday. And I think that was the first time I understood the human cost of climate change, because we always assume that everyone has a birthday, which they do, right? Everyone's born. But there's somewhat of a privilege to actually know when that is and to be able to celebrate it and to be able to like really remember the moment that you came into this world, and the fact that he will never have that, and there's no way to recover those records, there's no way to find his family, was really impactful for me at 8. So taking that with me, I think, is where I just started to figure out, well, what can I do about the climate crisis? And I was really active in high school and other places too, but yeah.
Did you see that affected your dad?
That's a good question. In some ways, yes. I will say my dad actually adopted me. So I was 2 when he came into my life. And I do think maybe one of the reasons he did that was because he himself was adopted. So I think that probably was one part of that impact. The second part is he's always been very interested in just like nature and homeopathic therapies. He's been vegan his entire life as an adult. And that too kind of came from his understanding of like the planet is important. So even growing up, I first learned about like carbon capture. You hear these terms today, but you know, you grow up on an island and we know that the ocean captures carbon. And whether we understand it in like the scientific way or not, you know, my dad kind of grew up saying these things. And I was like, oh, I never thought about the ocean helping, you know, keep the planet cool. But these are the things that he just taught naturally. And so I think his own interest in the planet, the environment, and the impact it has on us as humans, and even the animals, probably came from that experience. Today, he is just a businessman who works in logistics and who's trying to kind of start another company in Jamaica. But a lot of, I think, his commitment to climate, his commitment to health, his commitment to the planet kind of came from his own experience.
While like you said that impacted you at the age of 8, that's a very young age to be, to have those questions and understand those concepts too. While growing up, did you really think what you wanted to do? Because you said that this is something that, like you wanted to do something for the planet, and then you ended up becoming a US diplomat. What were the decisions that you were taking as you were taking them?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think today climate has a industry. And I think before, at least when I was growing up, there wasn't like an industry called climate, or, you know, climate change, we understood it, right? And so even in like middle school, high school, I was always a part of like our version of the Key Club. I kind of started a lot of our sustainability initiatives on campus. It'll be like, oh, let's go and clean up the park, or let's clean up the neighborhood nearby. I also think growing up in Chicago, especially on the south side of Chicago, where a lot of people aren't as familiar with these concepts of just like recycling, because we don't have a lot of just recycling bins in the community. Even not having like access to recycle things at our grocery stores, which I later learned in Europe as a diplomat, that you could just go and do these reverse vending machines. I was like, this is so cool. Like, we need this here. And so this idea of just like trying to keep the planet clean, I think, is how I started my journey into climate when I was younger. And it was just all about like recycling, trying to do more in that front. And then as I started to understand more about like climate change, you know, this is when Al Gore's like big documentary came out. And I was like, oh, there's so much more to this than just like picking up trash and trying to teach about that. And so that's really where I started diving deeper into like, well, how can my interest in like math and science, my commitment to climate.
For someone who doesn't know what US diplomat does, can you explain a little bit in layman's terms?
Yeah. So there are different types of US diplomats. Every federal agency here in the United States, not all of them, but most of them have what we call a foreign service. So foreign service officer is the formal term. And to become a foreign service officer, the process, at least in the US for the State Department, is that you take a series of exams. So there's a written test, there's like a multiple choice test, there's also an 8-hour kind of oral assessment where senior diplomats and former ambassadors do a lot of like I guess you would call it scenario-based work. So in this scenario, what would you do? And you kind of have to perform. Now, what does it mean to be a diplomat? It also varies by agency, but the ones that you probably have seen, and we're not at all like the TV show. I feel like
Yeah, because that it became so popular now because of the TV show.
yes, I wish it was that cool. We don't take our cell phones into the office. Like there are a lot of things we don't do, but we really serve like the main role is to represent the American people overseas. And we want everyone around the world to know that America is equally as diverse as the countries we're going into. And it's really important that people see that because for a long time, women weren't allowed to become foreign service officers at the State Department. We didn't really start to see that until the 70s. And then people of color, like Black people as well, also didn't really get access to the department until kind of like the civil rights movement, right? So you have a gap in who's represented for America overseas that doesn't even reflect kind of the composition of our own country. And so it's really important when we think about our diplomats as like, these are representatives of America here. And so we want you to see the diversity that we have in this country when we go to your countries. And what we do once we're there, it changes. So if I'm a consular officer, right, and you're someone who's either coming to the United States to study, to work, to visit friends and family, you're probably going to see a diplomat at the window. And usually that's a consular officer. Consular officers also help American citizens. So if you go to another country and you lose your passport or something terrible happens, if you get married, have a baby, or die, a consular officer will be there to support you too. So a part of our mission is to take care of those Americans when they are there, but also to help others who are trying to enter America find the right pathway through visas and in other ways. Another big part of what we do is public diplomacy. So whenever someone is there from the US Embassy or consulate to talk about our education system, is likely a public diplomacy officer. Whenever we have the Olympics, you're probably engaging with diplomats there too, because we have to represent the US in that case as well. Whenever we have different events to commemorate, you know, something huge in your country, like India's Independence Day, you'll have some of our public diplomacy officers at our different consulates and embassy kind of show up and write different articles. We might co-sponsor events. So we really are there to, one, help others learn about America, but also to help bring what you all know to Americans. And a lot of our exchange programs, Fulbright, those are your public diplomacy officers as well, who's kind of supporting that. I was a political officer, and the political and economic officers in the State Department, we handle more of what you would see in your TV shows. So a lot of those negotiations, handling sales of different defense materials, we work mostly bilaterally and multilaterally with those host country governments. So think about, you know, if there's someone we want to join the Human Rights Council that's an American citizen, and we want to advocate to other countries to sponsor their petition for the council, our role would be to go into those government agencies, to talk to them, to say, hey, this is our candidate, they're great. We hope that you would also vote yes at the UN and in other places. So that's a lot of the work that I did as well. So it's a lot. I will say careers.state.gov does a great job at just kind of outlining the different types of diplomats you could be when you join the State Department. And if you join some of our other diplomatic like agencies. So Treasury has their own diplomatic service. I think a few others too, but yeah.
How old were you?
I was 21 when I joined the Foreign Service. I was one of our youngest US diplomats.
Wow, you should be so proud of yourself. Like, I mean, to be that young and know all of these things, how did you sort of feel at that point? I mean, you're representing a country. Did you feel that burden on you?
Well, most people thought I was the intern. So once I like went into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lithuania, and I actually had an intern with me who was a grad student from like a law school, and he was interning with the State Department that summer. And the other diplomat who was supposed to be meeting me, introduce themselves to my intern. And I was like, oh, that's great, but I'm here to represent the US.
Oh,
So that was
yeah.
always fun. And I would say even internally in the State Department, it was a little challenging to being so young,
Mm.
especially since the average age is about 35. And so, there are differences too, just in like, family composition. What does it mean to go overseas single and to try to date in different countries as a US diplomat, which also comes with certain requirements because, we are there to represent the United States. We have access to certain information, and it's important to have like security background checks on a lot of people. So just trying to get a boyfriend, it was really hard because
Yeah.
it
Well,
required a lot.
so through that process, what did you learn about yourself? You were so young, you were navigating so many different roles and challenges that you were doing at your job. And you're also trying, like at 21, people are trying to figure out their, career path, and you were doing so much more than that. What did you learn about yourself?
I learned that I don't work very well in large bureaucratic organizations, which is why I left. And what I found as a conflict of interest is that I'm a very collaborative person. And as you probably have seen, I like to connect the dots across probably what may appear to be completely unrelated things. And while that really worked well for me analyzing a situation in a country, right? So let's say when I was in Jakarta, Indonesia, there was a terrorist attack that happened. And part of my job is to report on that so that we are like aware of what's happening on the ground, what were the motivations behind it, and to inform Washington of why these things are happening. And so even when that like small incident happened, my brain was like, oh, we also need to like work with our defense colleagues and then work with our finance colleagues because there's some like funding involved in this, right? But the State Department or the Foreign Service sometimes can be very singular, and it's really hard to be as collaborative. It's also an up or out system, and so when you join so young and when you join at an entry level, there are a lot of you, but not everyone becomes an ambassador, and not everyone makes it to the senior Foreign Service. And so you have this like competition internally to get tenure, to get to the next level, so that you do make it to the senior Foreign Service if this is your long-term career path. And as a result, being so young, being a collaborative person, making all these like dots in my head as I'm analyzing situations, I tried to be friends with everyone. I wanted to work with everyone. And eventually I learned that not everyone wants to do that because it might impact their own professional trajectory.
Mm.
So there are little things like that where I realized kind of my role was limited in how I could collaborate because I was so young. It also made some other parts of my job difficult. I served as a human rights officer at one post, and if you're, I had a woman whose partner was kidnapped in another country and being tortured because he was a journalist, and this country didn't allow journalists. And so she got asylum to come to the country that I was based in with her newborn child. And I had to sit there to do the intake for this person. And of course, at first it was like, oh, you're so young. How do I know you're going to take me seriously? And then it was, okay, I really need someone at this embassy to hear my story so that you can try to help my husband. And I think being young, but also empathetic, allowed her to open up more. And it got us a lot of information to try to support her case. So there were some benefits to it. And I guess the last challenge was just all of my staff were much older than I was.
Mm.
And when you're responsible for doing performance reviews for someone who's like 55 and you're 21, it's like, okay, I could do this. But I also would love your feedback too. And I think that created a different type of dynamic, but it's also helped me now manage teams more effectively.
Yeah, there's so much that you said. It, at such a young age, there's so many different things that you're seeing too, that can impact your personal life. That's one thing. Like, how did you kind of keep a clear head, not to take, the sorrows back home? And second is also, now, having managed so many people who are like much older to you, have you realized and found your voice in a way that you can be assertive irrespective of your age or your gender?
Yeah. Um, I guess I'll take the second question first.
Okay.
I will say, having worked in kind of intergenerational settings where I had to take a leadership role, it was more challenging because there's also the culture dynamic.
Mm,
And when you're also overseas as a woman of color that's American in a country where they're just not used to seeing you at all, and that happened in multiple countries, it creates a different level of like complexity that I now think I'm able to navigate a lot better. So, for example, building a startup is complicated, but I'm also like hiring, engineers who are from other parts of the world. And I'm trying to bring together a team where they would have to work together. And
mm,
because I served in Lithuania, India, Indonesia, and I've managed different teams and different dynamics, I've learned ways to communicate that allows me to be both assertive and both respectful. And so it is a challenge, right? When you're like, okay, I'm the boss, and you're technically supposed
yeah.
to do what I say to do anyway. But I'm also like cognizant of like your cultural background, your needs, you coming to a new place like Chicago from wherever you came from. And then you're also trying to navigate that. So if anything, I would say it made me more empathetic. It
Mm,
allowed me to kind of bridge cultural communication gaps that I think if you haven't lived in another country with other groups of people before, and you're trying to communicate in a certain way, I could be very type A and I could say, do this, do this, do that by this date. And if you don't, here's the consequence. But I've
mm,
learned that other communities prefer that type of communication in a different way. And so it's a little hard to give like one like
mm.
example. It is very unique, but I think empathy and kind of cross-cultural communication are kind of the two soft skills that I gained while working in all these different environments. And then being able to use that now as a founder and as someone who has to sell my company, sell my vision, sell to team members, investors, and customers, I can do that a lot more effectively.
Yeah. No, I think empathy is something that really helps, and it's understanding the other side and being able to navigate those situations and being able to give that helps. Have you ever had a situation where it was challenging to be taken seriously?
A few times, yes. I think when we talk about like being taken seriously, it's not necessarily like what I'm saying is questioned. It's more
Yeah.
about, do you have the authority to say it?
Mm,
And what's helped is having that title as diplomat
mm,
kind of set the baseline there.
okay.
I think the biggest challenge, however, is when there's conflict happening at home in the US
Mm,
and it's well known in other countries. And then people want to know, like, what are your thoughts on it? So, like, Black Lives Matter. There was a moment where there was a lot of violence against people that look like me in this country being done by other Americans to
mm,
Americans. And when you're overseas, those conversations come up. It could come from me talking to a group of students, talking to other diplomats, just at the grocery store. And so, how you handle those things is where I found the most complicated, especially during that time. And I think a good example is I was giving a lecture at a university in Lithuania. And of course, someone had a question because they had just heard about, Trayvon Martin and some others here in the US. And they're like, well, how can you represent your country when your country wouldn't represent you, or something like that? And so when you get that type of question, You have to decide, do I answer as the diplomat or do I answer as like the Black person from Chicago?
Yeah.
Or is there a way to be respectful of both of those identities? And that's where I feel like sometimes you wouldn't be taken seriously depending on how you responded. And I did my best to say, yes, there are challenges in our country. And yes, there are challenges to people like me, but that's also one of the reasons why I'm here. And that's how you get to meet more people of color, more Black people like myself, because while our country has its problems, we've also created pathways to try to rectify them as well. So there, all these unique ways to say, yes, we have issues. Yes, it matters. Yes, I'm still here. But that was difficult.
So how do you kind of keep your personal aside and not bring back all the learnings, or like not, sorry, not learnings, all these different, like you mentioned, having to talk to people who are going through so much. How do you come back without taking it personally?
That I've gone to a lot of therapy post leaving the State Department.
Because you were so young too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is difficult, right? It's especially depending on your role. So not everyone has to deal with some of those like human rights situations. It's just that was a title that I held. I also did more military defense work, kind of political work too. And I think because my portfolio across different countries was so mixed, I was able to kind of compartmentalize a little bit. So I knew if I was going to talk to someone in the Ministry of Defense to oversee some type of like defense materials, I'm less emotional. And, I have to become like very strict. I remember I started trying to wear more makeup to look older, and I only wore like these black and gray suits the entire time. It's like when I left the State Department, I actually hired a stylist because I was like, oh, like how do I dress like someone in their mid-20s? I didn't know how to do this. So I will say that I've become very good at just like compartmentalizing those things. But like, for example, the woman, with her child and that situation, honestly, I already knew the outcome and I knew I couldn't tell her because I knew that that would exasperate the emotional situation that was already there. But going back to like my desk, I did everything I could to get an answer and to inform those in the country where her husband was taken. And so in some ways, writing it down and just sending it off was how I was able to just let it go. But I will say I had to go through a lot of therapy and just talk to these things out.
Yeah, it's really hard. Was it a hard decision to walk away?
No, it was time. It's a unique space because while you have like your core responsibilities and the work you're supposed to do, what I really enjoyed the most was building things. And, not a lot of my colleagues had the same technical background as I did coming into the State Department. A lot of people are either former lawyers or they studied like history or politics. Like they had very kind of public policy facing kind of academic careers. And there were some scientists and others as well. But none of them had like this interest in how do we quantify what's going on here. So a lot of the work products that I created at the State Department, I was among the first to like use kind of visualizations and graphs and charts to not just show like, hey, this problem happened and here's all the qualitative reasons, but to actually start to measure it. Like how many terrorist attacks did we have in this particular region of this country? And where other layers can we layer on top of that? Like what's the predominant religion there? What's the demographic breakdown from age and gender? I created a de-radicalization program in Indonesia called Mother Schools, where there are Indonesian young people, mostly men, who, I don't know how they managed to do this, got from Indonesia all the way to Syria to join ISIS, and then figured out how to come back. So the government was like, okay, we could either imprison them or try to integrate them back into society. And and I was like, well, who's the one person in these countries that they know if they say something wrong to, they might get in trouble? And I was like, maybe it's like America, it's their mom. So surprisingly, it was the moms. And having mothers de-radicalize former terrorist fighters was such a huge success. And just like seeing that again, kind of going back to my original interest of women as, everything, that was kind of weird. That was a really cool way that, I got to practice at work. But the reason I left is also because I missed my family. And when you do go somewhere so young, you kind of miss things. Like I have 3 younger sisters. They had all graduated from high school at this point. Some were graduating from college, and I just wasn't there. And when my sister had her first child, my nephew Tristan, who kind of led my journey to my startup, I was like, wow, like I missed that. And I don't want to miss that again. And this was around COVID. So it was 2020. And, as a diplomat, we weren't at home, but we did kind of get the same opportunity to like reflect and think about your priorities. And so that was how I made my decision to leave, to go back home and to be with my family.
Oh, wow. I mean, at such a young age, you went through so much. There's so much learning. And then you went into the next journey of your life, which is, building your startup. But again, what was that journey like in terms of I feel like you have this nature of problem solving when you see something and you see there's something going on and it cannot be solved. You take matters into your own hands and try to figure out a solution for it, which is what you did with your startup and which is what you did, in the previous career in your being a US diplomat. So tell us a little bit about what that journey was like in terms of, understanding about autism. That itself in it, it's a whole journey learning about. I have my older sister is autistic, and at the time there weren't, because I didn't grow up in US, I grew up in Oman. So we traveled around a lot for my autistic sister to get the right kind of, tools, and she was on, I would say, the medium spectrum. So even those were not things that at that back then my parents knew what it was, and even the term autism was not very well aware outside. So yeah, tell me, how did you kind of learn about these challenges, and how did you navigate through those big decisions?
Yeah. So when I left the State Department, I didn't go straight into like startup mode. Went into management consulting, which I figured there are certain problems at the State Department that I wanted to solve, and I thought maybe I could do that outside the government. And that still allowed me to come home and allow me to be with my family. And again, around like 2020 is when I realized like, okay, this is around the time I should go. It's also when, and again, like the department is it's a unique space because you do get to really flex what you do. So when the president put a ban on travel during 2020 to come to the United States, he also, in a presidential proclamation, gave non-interest exceptions. So if you were coming here as a doctor on a J1 visa or some other type of visa, you could apply for an exception. Or if you were, someone who could support critical infrastructure. Our process was really manual, and I figured out a way to automate that national like interest exception review process, because otherwise it was just me and a ton of other consular officers reading through emails of people saying, please let us in.
Yeah.
I was like, we can't do this. So building out a system that automated that process got a lot of attention at the department, because they're like, well, we didn't know we had diplomats who could do that.
Yeah.
And going through the bureaucratic red tape to get it done was also a headache, but we did get it done. And so they were like, well, now we're withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, and we need someone to help build the system to manage the evacuations. And so that also is like the work that I started doing that got me also back to DC. So I built our crisis evacuation response system that was an interagency platform that the military used, nonprofits, NGOs on the ground to really help expedite getting out folks from Afghanistan and relocating here. And so that opened up the opportunity for a consulting company to be like, hey, since you have the technical background, you understand how the government works, how about you come join our team? You can stay in the US, because otherwise I would have had to go back overseas and I couldn't be with my nephew. And you can continue to work on the causes you care about, but from the tech side. And so that's what I did for about 2 years in consulting, kind of helping build software, not just for the State Department, but for other federal agencies, until I left to go to grad school. And that's where I really discovered kind of this interest in building a startup, because that's also when my nephew kind of lost access to care. And so just like hearing your story about, navigating autism resources in Oman for your older sister, and you're right, like there's an entire generation of people who just did not have access to what is now like behavioral therapy and all these other treatments. Yeah. And so, yes, that journey of just learning about it was extremely difficult because, I think there is a period of like, well, maybe not my child, right? Like, I think that is a moment that parents go through. And my sister went through that moment too. And at some point, having 3 younger sisters and a ton of cousins, I've seen enough children to understand developmentally where they should be at different stages. And so when my nephew wasn't talking around the time that most children start verbalizing, and when he wasn't making eye contact and he wasn't responding to his name, like there were certain things that was happening. The other challenge is he was born March 2020. So everything was also shut down. And so like, the government resources to try to support him just didn't exist either. And so me initially trying to do that overseas, and then once I got back home, it was a journey of just like talking to doctors, talking to pediatricians. I discovered there are developmental pediatricians. And I was like, okay, how do I get one? And they're like, oh, it's an 18-month wait list. And I was like, no, how do I get one now? So I went onto every wait list. And then I found about like ABA therapy and all these other resources around speech therapy and all these things. And I was like, okay, well, how do I put him there? And they're like, oh, it's going to cost money because the public insurance doesn't reimburse it. And this is very early on. So that journey of learning wasn't just like how to understand autism, but it's like, how do I understand the support to treat them to?
Yeah. I mean, it's so eye-opening that even after so many years that there's so many challenges that parents have to go through to even, I mean, you're emotionally trying to figure out this process because like you said, even my parents went through that phase of denial. And my mom was like 21 when she had my, older sister. And then she went through that phase of denial, both of them, and they put her in a regular school, and she struggled there because she was not able to fit in. But knowing that happens even now, and the healthcare system is still, not accessible for the parents. What have you learned through this process? Like, what is the best way for someone who is dealing with that? And then also, like, what led you to create your startup, and what have you learned through that process too, like to be able to start, because you're also navigating, your nephew is dealing with all this, and to be able to come up with a startup at that point too is it's just a lot, right? Like to be a founder, to deal with family member having to go through all of this process. So yeah, talk us through that.
Yeah, so I will say, I guess a few learnings, right? So what I've learned about trying to navigate the healthcare system. Now, any woman who wants to give birth, my recommendation is that you get on a wait list for a developmental pediatrician, right? Like signs of developmental delays don't really start to appear or manifest until about 18 months. And because of the wait list right now for developmental pediatricians, I'm like, if you know you're pregnant and you're going to give birth, and even if you don't know if your child will have autism or not, it doesn't hurt, right? You can always start with a developmental pediatrician for the first 18 months and then go to a normal one afterwards. So that's usually like my first like point of advice, because I saw my sister struggle, because I then struggled trying to do it too. Like,
Yeah.
definitely that's the first piece. I think the second learning that I got just about like the healthcare system and autism too is that there are different perspectives on how to treat young children on the spectrum. But the reality is that 1 in 36 children today, at least in the United States, have autism. And when that number continues to grow, and the resources around how do we even diagnose, how do we evaluate, how do we assess, right? Even the diagnosis and evaluation is different from the assessment. It makes it really hard for a parent or a caregiver or a guardian or a sister who's helping out to understand, like, what am I supposed to be doing differently now? So at one point, I adopted my nephew because my sister was going through postpartum after giving birth, and she was also working in the medical field. And so she was just like, I can't do both. And her partner and her had separated. And so I was like, okay, well, Tristan, now it's me and you. And, then I was like, okay, now I need to figure out, like, where do I take you? And so, like, the state, the government does have a program called early intervention. So before your child turns 3, the government, regardless of your income, will give you support at your home, where they'll bring in specialists to do the review, the analysis, the diagnosis, the assessment, and then give you a treatment plan. And you can have a choice. You can put your child into a public school that has special needs classrooms for young children under 3, or you can have specialists come to your home, or you can send them to a daycare center and the specialist will go there. So just figuring all of that out while working full time and trying to take care of my nephew was a lot. And then I discovered that there's ABA therapy. And I didn't know at the time that some people look down on ABA therapy, some people don't like it.
Okay.
So ABA is behavioral analysis therapy, and there are certain types of professionals, usually they're master's levels, called board certified behavioral analyst, BCBAs, and these are therapists. And under them, you'll have a registered behavior technician. And so they typically work with children from like 3 to 8. And they give them different tools to cope with. So like for my nephew, eye contact was really hard. Responding to his name was really difficult. And so they would train me as a caregiver and him on just different methods to get his attention. So like, what's a high reward treat that I could give my nephew from when he looks at me when I call his name? And at that time it was gummy bears. So I was like, okay, Tristan. When he looked at me, I gave him a gummy bear. So like they teach different like behavioral changes. Another challenge he had was like chewing on things that were non-edible. So if you gave him a toy, he would immediately put it in his mouth instead of play with it. And so they would teach him how to not do that and maybe do something else instead. And so that entire field has completely blown up. There are schools now that will graduate BCBAs. They own a lot of the autism centers. And then they started bringing in other specialties like speech therapists, because my nephew is still nonverbal, and occupational therapists, where they teach him how to like eat with a spoon and how to tie his shoe. But what I loved about it is that they also taught me, because I don't know what's right and what's not right. I actually taught him something bad, according to one of the former therapists, where I was like, oh, like if something happens to me, I want to make sure you can just go and get food. So I showed him how to like push a chair to the counter and jump on the countertop to get food out the pantry. And then the therapist was like, no, you can't do that. So I've learned a lot there, but of course, building the startup is a whole new lesson, because I'm trying to figure out, how do you take the public insurance, because there are more children who don't have the benefits of families who have, private commercial insurance and a lot of money that they can pay out of pocket for these services. And Medicaid, which is kind of what's given to families who live below the poverty line, doesn't always reimburse this type of work. And if they do, it just takes so much paperwork, so much compliance to get it done, that some providers don't think it's worth it. And in order to make this care accessible, and because my nephew matters, and a lot of children who may not be able to afford the more expensive care should get care too, that's what we started to build at Carelumi. And that was kind of our first use case, is automating the credentialing for Medicaid for autism providers, who are some of our early customers, so that they could take more children with Medicaid who are also on the spectrum.
So, what was the first thing? Like, when was it that after dealing with how many customers, like customers in the sense that patients, is when you realize that this is something that you need to do?
I will say it was really just dealing with my nephew's providers first, right? Because, you know, children with autism, one thing that they try to teach is like how we can get them to be open to other people. Because sometimes they can say, like, this is my person. This is who I go to when I want food, when I want to play.
Yeah.
And that's like a dependency. And so one of the nice parts about the therapy is that they will rotate some of their providers, like their registered behavior technician, the person who works with them day to day, so that they can get familiar with new people. However, as a parent or a caregiver or a guardian, you become attached as well to those providers because it's like you've seen his journey. And because I'm very quantitative, I also made sure that his providers are quantitative, right? So
Yeah.
they will tell me, like, oh, he said 5 words in January and now he's saying 25 by March. And I would want to measure like that development across multiple things. So when they told me that they wouldn't take the Medicaid, I was like, no, no, no. Like he has to stay here because I like you, he likes you, and I'm actually seeing progress that I can measure. And so doing that paperwork for them, figuring out how to use AI because it keeps improving and it's making so much of this work faster to automate it, they were just blown away. And that's when they were like, well, the clinic down the street needs this, that one around the corner does. And that's how we build our first customer base, because it's not that they don't want to take this insurance. It's just the amount of time, effort, and money they lose waiting makes it less, appealing. And so that's really when I was like, okay, well, if all these people want this, and I didn't charge his providers, I just wanted them to take him back, then I should probably figure out a way to sell it to all their friends too. And that's how we got started.
Why do you think this didn't exist before?
Mostly because it's a manual process. And again, because I'm not a healthcare person, I think for me, I looked at this as like what is wrong with the system? And then I did my deep dives that I do, and then I try to connect dots. And I think because I viewed this as someone not from healthcare, and I brought in more of like the technical perspective on like how do I automate the process once I figured out how to simplify it, it was like, oh, of course we can do this, right? Like we can do this really easily and quickly. The challenge, however, is that every health insurance company has different sets of rules, right? So these are we call them the payers. And then every payer's rules change depending on what state you're in. So if you're in California and you're an autism provider and you take whatever the commercial plan is, but then you might also take Medicaid, you're dealing with now rules from Medicaid, rules from that commercial plan, and rules from the state of California to be an autism provider. And so if you're trying to automate credentialing, you need to understand those rules because they change. So, we had a customer who didn't know that starting January 1st this year, all their therapists need to sign off on the notes in order for the insurance company to reimburse you. So they were getting rejected, their claims, for 3 weeks until the insurance company sent an email saying, hey, don't forget this rule came out and that's why we've been rejecting your claims. And they're like, we didn't know this. So what we did was we built the first graph database that indexed all 25,000 rules for every state, city, county, and payer. And that was probably about 12 months of work. But graph databases are better for AI and agentic solutions, especially large language models, because they kind of function the way a large language model will as too. So with that, that's how we've been able to unlock it. And that's what a lot of our competitors don't have. And that's kind of our technical moat as well. So once you know the rules and the agent knows how to find the rules, getting the data, filling out the applications, correcting the errors is the easy part. And that's why we've been able to accelerate as quickly as we have.
When did you realize that you need to build a team? What were the first steps that you took in order to, build a startup?
Yeah. I think because I'm in business school now, that probably
It's a
helped a
challenge
lot.
too. Like you're also studying and you're building a startup and you're also being a care, like you're doing so much.
I know. I'm learning how to find time to sleep. That's like my new thing, but I'm very excited to graduate next quarter. So, in business school, we have different competitions, and I had joined our entrepreneurship VC club, eventually became a co-chair. But during probably my fall quarter, there was like, come to this event where you just talk about a problem you want to solve. And I was like, okay, I've never pitched, Carelumi or this problem with my nephew's care, but I thought maybe this would be a great place to do it. And so I did. And then people just came up to me afterwards being like, hey, I want to help you solve this.
Oh,
And
wow.
it just kind of started from there. Now, when did I know I needed a team? I think that's when the work became less of like, oh, I can do this myself for one individual clinic to, oh, people want to pay me now. So how do I take money? And then once they paid me, they want to actually see a system, right? So because I think we're so used to software having a login and a website and all these things, it's like, okay, I now need to build a product. And because I've worked in product management, building like technical proprietary tools for the government, like that was the easy part. But then I didn't think about who my users were, right? Like they're no longer kind of government officials and bureaucrats who are forced to build and use what I build. These are people who are now paying to use it and they have opinions. I was like, oh wow, I now need to like listen to them. So
Yeah.
when it was about money, customer discovery, product development, that's when I was like, I can't do it alone and I need others to kind of help me pull this together.
So, how did you kind of build your team?
So the first way was again kind of through pitching in school. The second way is that U Chicago had a lot of like undergraduate
Mm.
students who were just looking for opportunities to work in startup environments. And so bringing on some of those interns really helped as well. So I'm going to pitch events on campus, but I'm also just going in Chicago, right? So like if you use Luma, and I think you can filter by city, you can type in like entrepreneur or founder, and I would just do that. And once I found like events that weren't too far from me, I would just go. I would talk about the problem. I'm like, I'm really upset about this problem. I think you should be too. People
Yeah.
are. And then they would come up to me. I'm also really big in like the AI space here as well, just given my background and my interest. And so there are different communities like the AI Collective that's pretty global. AI Tinkerers is like a technical meetup of folks in AI as well. So you can go there, you can do demos, and you can also just pitch. And so even there, I would be networking with people, and they're like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "I'm trying to help my nephew get his care back." And they're like, "What?" And
Yeah.
then you tell them, and then they want to join. So I feel like your early team as a startup, people are really joining because of you. They're
Mm.
joining because of the problem, and that's what I've learned how to sell really well.
Wow. What advice would you have for someone through all of the experiences that you've had? Now, I mean, being a US diplomat and as a consultant, and now, building something, like you said, that journey was so different from this. Being a founder is completely like, I mean, you have to, create this whole ecosystem and also listen to your customers. And, there's so many aspects of it, just building the product. And in your case, it's also there's an emotional I feel like there's an emotional toll in terms of like, dealing with the patients and understanding where they come from. I feel like through this conversation, empathy is something that you always um, led your life with. And I think that helps in your current journey too. So, what advice would you have for someone who is dealing or like trying to start their own and find their path?
Yeah. Hmm. That's a good question. I will say empathy has been kind of my North Star.
Yeah.
If I had to think like a soft skill, but if I take like a 100,000 foot view on life, you
Wow.
know, I always go back to like my dad telling me at 8 that he didn't know his birthday. And then I started empathizing, thinking of myself at 2, or a child not having my family, and just understanding that journey of us as like young people, right? Because I think sometimes when you're an adult now, you kind of forget that you were a kid once.
Mm.
And even then, like some of those earlier experiences are actually still who shape who I am today. So like when you talk to anyone in my family, or if someone sees me, they're going to know me not as like the person you see here. They're probably going to remember me as like the 8-year-old or the 12-year-old. And they're going to remember that that person was always like reading books and randomly doing multiplication tables because I was a very odd child. So like, those are kind of the things that I had to take a moment to sit down and reflect on, especially when I made my transition out of the government. Because I was trying to figure out, like, how do I present myself now to the world?
Yeah.
And, thankfully there were consulting roles available, but, going into this new era of AI and, seeing entry-level roles not really existing anymore, and, not really knowing what value you can bring to the market when so much of things are being automated. It creates some fear there. So my advice would be, go back to the beginning. Even if you just have to sit down, talk to your mom, dad, whoever knew you from the beginning, and just ask them, like, what was the one thing that you remember the most about me as a child? And it might be, oh, you talk too much, or, you could always drawing on the walls, or, you're always pushing back on everything I said. But even those like early experiences kind of shape a lot about who you become. Because while I was the child who was always pushing back, that's because I realized I was an advocate. And if I didn't agree with the decision my mom made for me and my sisters, I told her. And that helped me negotiate things when I was a diplomat. And it helps me negotiate now when I'm talking to investors, right? And it's because I had that very young, and I didn't have someone like punish me for it,
Mm.
but I still feel confident in doing that. And I do think the future of our careers, of our livelihoods, or however we go about this world is going to be grounded in those soft skills, whether that's empathy, whether that's communication, whether that's collaboration, and being able to name it from the beginning and to see how it's evolved over your time is going to uncover so many more insights into where you should go next. Because I think it's less about industry, less about role, more about you and what you bring to unlock more good. I don't know. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my advice. I know it's kind of like soft and maybe not the
Oh,
best, but
no, that's the best advice. And I think, like you mentioned, the fear right now exists. And you've been using AI for not just your startup, even before that, you've been really using AI in every aspect. According to you, what do you think AI can't replace?
can't replace. Well, I guess maybe when we talk about AI too, right? Like thinking of it as a tool,
Mm.
right? And understanding that where AI is today is it's mind blowing even to me. Um, you know, I graduated from Duke back in, gosh, now I'm aging myself, 2017. And at that time, Google had just released its paper on transformers, like all the like cool things that made AI possible just started in conversation
Mm.
early 2017. And I think because of that, a lot of us who have been in this space from the beginning kind of dismissed it. Like there was a moment where data science and all these things were just like, okay, we just need you to analyze trends and give me a visual and answer these questions. And so when you were just doing that, you're like, okay, fine. Like this is my job. I can clean data. I can do this really well. Now, large language models can do that much better and much faster.
Mm.
And a lot of just like root memorization tasks that kind of were repetitive, a lot of those are the things that are going to kind of go away. Where there's still opportunity for young people and just anyone looking to change their careers or go into a new space, I would say it's more around how do we monitor the effectiveness of AI, especially as AI becomes agentic, right? So before you had a chatbot, you put in some words, you get some words back.
Yeah.
Now you can have like an agent go to your email, unsubscribe you from everything,
Yeah.
and text you like, hey, this is done, right? Open Claw. I built my little claw bot. I named him Sebastian from The Little Mermaid because I had needed him to have a Jamaican accent. So
Oh,
we talk in like text on Telegram, but like it's becoming to the point where I wouldn't need a personal assistant to make my nail appointments and things like that now because Sebastian can do it for me.
yes, that.
But there are going to be things like ethics and philosophy and understanding welfare and starting to question like, okay, if intelligence is how we think, how we do, if that's how you want to name it, consciousness, is it how we are? And then what happens when tools are intelligent, but then eventually start making decisions on their own? And is there an area there? And I think anyone who's interested in these questions and who are kind of going, and I know maybe 10 years ago it was like, become an engineer. I'm going to say become a philosopher. And I would say study philosophy, sociology, art, history, because I think that's where the future is going, ethics. And it's going to be, what are the guardrails we need to keep the autonomous future of work aligned with who we are as humans
Yeah.
and not so far out there that we can't control it one day. That being said, I think product management is still going to be a job, unfortunately, if people are coming from those type of backgrounds, but you no longer need to be technical, right? And my thing is, if you are out there, like even when I'm interviewing folks to come to Carelumi, some of the questions I offer is like, what is your personal AI tech stack? Are you using Granola to take notes? Like what are you use to make your work life efficient? And then the other questions are, have you ever built a product? And so even if you're like, oh, I've never worked in product management, blah, 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 I want to know if you've used Lovable or Versal or just something to vibe code and kind of see how it works. Because I think the people who are taking the initiative to at least try are going to be the winners versus those who are like, oh, I'm not going to use this. It's whatever reason not to. Yeah.
So, what are some of the tools that you would advise people use that has changed your life?
So first, I highly recommend you use Perplexity. I am also a brand ambassador, so there is that. Nice. But I'm also an evangelist. Like I truly do love Perplexity as a search engine. And now we just released last year the Comet browser. So Perplexity Comet completely replaces Google Chrome, Safari, whatever your default browser is. And it's your first introduction to like, what does an agentic model do? You can use the Comet browser assistant to write emails for you. Like you'll see it take over the screen. You can have it do research in other tabs while you're working on something else. If you have required trainings for your job and you don't want to sit there, watch the video and answer the questions, the Comet agent can do it for you. So there's so many cool ways for you to like get a very early introduction to the future, I think, of all browsers using Comet, and it's free. And also just helps you understand use cases for other AI tools. Perplexity also lets you choose different models. So if you don't want to get the Claude subscription, you can choose Claude Sonnet 4.6 within Perplexity and start to see how it works. So I think Perplexity is the best tool for anyone interested in learning more about how to use AI. I think the Comet browser, if you're like, oh, wow, I'm like ready to go agentic. And then today, Perplexity released computer mode. And I think that is where we're getting to the future, where you can now have the AI use your actual laptop. So my desktop is a mess. So I take a lot of screenshots. And I was like, oh, I need someone to clean up all of these screenshots and organize them. So like, here are screenshots of like, different things you liked on the internet, and they put that in a folder. So like it's reading the screenshot, is looking at the image, and is categorizing it in a way that would take me hours to do and I would never do it.
Mm.
Now I'm like, oh, here are all the product screenshots that I took and I know what to change. So Perplexity Comet is probably the first thing I would recommend. And I can share a link if someone wants to use that to get the
Yeah.
pro version for free for 2 months. Other tools, very quickly, Granola. I love Granola. It's also free. It's a note taker, but what I also like it as a founder is that whenever I'm doing product interviews or like discovery interviews, getting feedback from customers, talking to investors, I can group those interviews into different folders, and then you can use the Granola chat to prompt it. So I can say, what are all the insights from these type of customers, and what changes should I make to my product because of that? Or what are all the questions investors had that I now need to improve in my pitch deck so I can have it in the appendix? And so it goes beyond just recording a transcript, putting into ChatGPT, asking ChatGPT questions. It actually brings it all into a way that is intuitive. And similar to Perplexity, you can choose the model. So maybe you prefer Claude's output over Gemini or ChatGPT, and it allows you to do that. I think the last big one I would recommend is actually Google and Gemini. So if you're a student, you get Gemini Pro for free for 12 months if you use your email. If you're not a student, the Pro access is pretty affordable as well. And I would say if you had to choose today between ChatGPT and Gemini, I'm probably going to watch this like years from now, but I would say go with Gemini. And really play around with like its suite of tools. Like I use Gmail Workspace for Carelumi. It's my personal Gmail too. Now I have like the Gemini having different workflows. So every time an investor emails me, it tags it, it moves it to an Excel spread, like a Google Sheet, even has an auto reply set up. And all of this is for free, more or less, within like your existing suite of things. So Gemini Pro, Comet Perplexity, and Granola are kind of like the trifecta of peak efficiency when it comes to AI. But it does cause risk, right? Because it could also mean that a lot of startups are going to start to shut down because a lot of the larger players are building the solutions already.
Yeah.
And that's something we're also thinking about.
Thank you so much, Shai. That was really useful. Yeah, it got me thinking how I can also use it in a much more effective way. Uh, we always end our conversation with your favorite quote and a favorite book that changed your life.
Favorite quote. Oh man. I don't know if I have a favorite quote yet, but I was doing a customer just like discovery interview because we started talking to like veterinarian clinics to see if they also need similar like credentialing because everyone has pets and maybe they get pet insurance. I have pet insurance. And one of the vets told me that your vibe attracts your tribe. And I was like, oh, I never thought of that. So that's been like playing in the back of my head for the last 2 days. My vibe attracts my tribe. So that's one that I've been thinking about. And then favorite book would have to be Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I read it when I was 14. I still have like a physical copy from my like AP English literature class. And it's the one book that I've taken to every country in the world that I've ever been to. And so I would say that's given me like my foundation of just understanding that change is inevitable and that you can't fight it, but you can shape it. And I think in this era of AI now, when things are rapidly changing, we just don't know. It's a great book to figure out how to shape the change that's coming.
Oh, Shai, thank you so much on that beautiful note. Thank you so much. This was such a beautiful conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and in such a short span, you've done so much. So thank you so much for being so candid and sharing all your different journey and being so honest about everything.
So that was Shai. What I kept coming back to after this conversation is how many of the most meaningful paths in life start with something deeply personal. It's not usually a strategy or a market opportunity, but a moment where you see a problem up close and you decide you just can't ignore it. Shai's story is a reminder that empathy isn't a personal trait. It can be a way of seeing the world, a way of leading, and sometimes even the foundation of the things we build. And I also loved what she said about going back to the beginning, remembering who you were as a child, the instincts you had before the world told you what was realistic and practical. Oh, that's so important. And because sometimes the clue to your future isn't something new you need to find, it's something that's been there all along. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe to Be Anomalous for more stories from people who are building lives and careers outside the lines. And if you thought of anyone during this episode, please don't forget to share and please subscribe, it's free. I promise you, I will keep getting you more stories and make this time worth it. So until then, be bold, be real, and be anomalous.